Welcome back to CEEN Caribbean News. It's now time for In Depth. Last Wednesday, the European Commission released a list of 30 countries identified as the worst tax havens in the world. The countries on the register had been named by at least 10 EU member states as problematic because they were not doing enough to crack down on tax avoidance. That list includes 15 Caribbean countries, among which is St. Kitts and Nevis. Immediately after the list was released, the stories from the Twin Island Federation questioned its inclusion, and now St. Kitts and Nevis has formally requested to be removed from the list, which the European Commission now says has not been finalized. To discuss this and other major happenings in the country, we have been joined by Minister of Foreign Affairs for St. Kitts and Nevis, the Honourable Mark Brantley. Welcome to In Depth, Mr. Brantley.
Thank you, and thank you for having me again. Good evening to yourself and your listeners all around the world.
Thank you. Now, reports on Monday out of St. Kitts and Nevis say the government will be writing to the European Commission to formally request its exclusion from the list. Has that letter been drafted at this time?
Not only has it been drafted, the relevant notes have been sent to the EU. We have indeed sought to engage them in a constructive way and in an immediate and urgent way to have us removed from this unfortunate list. We have seen some backpedaling, in our view, in the sense that it is now a suggestion that it may not be necessarily an EU official list, but rather a compilation of a minimum of 10 countries if they've had an issue with you. When we look at the 10 countries which we have heard have had an issue with St. Kitts and Nevis, we have not been engaged by any of them. We see countries there which are mostly from the Eastern Bloc, the former Soviet bloc, many of them, and countries which really we have had no engagement with of any nature. And so it's not a question that we are uncooperative. To the contrary, we have never been engaged with these particular countries, and that has posed some difficulties. The other countries of the EU with which we engage regularly, those countries do not appear to have a difficulty with us. St. Kitts and Nevis has been very proactive in terms of tax transparency. We have participated in a very robust way with the OECD Global Forum on Tax Transparency. Indeed, we have done 2 peer reviews, the last of which was last August of 2014, less than a year ago, when their finding, having reviewed us, was that we were largely compliant. And largely compliant, we are told, is the gold standard, because never do we get fully compliant for most jurisdictions. And so we couldn't quite understand how the Global Forum, a grouping of the OECD, in which we have participated, has given us not just a passing grade, but an excellent grade in relation to tax transparency and tax information exchange. And these countries, a group of 10 from the EU, are at one and the same time saying that we are non-cooperative and are putting us on some so-called blacklist. And so we have protested formally, and I had occasion, in fact, to meet just this morning with the Belgian ambassador, and we raised these issues with them. We're raising these issues with all the relevant stakeholders, because we think that this is unfortunate in the extreme, that we would be subjected to this after demonstrating quite clearly our willingness to engage the international community in a positive way.
Now,
over the last several years, for example, we have signed off on some 25 tax information exchange arrangements with various countries, most of which are within the European Union. And so it appears that some aspects, some parts of the EU are saying one thing, other parts are saying something else. The OECD, which obviously is a grouping, an international grouping, they're saying one thing. This group of 10 from the EU is now saying something else. So we're asking for some consistency, and the real risks reputationally for our country in being included on such a list are really unfortunate in this day and age that we'll come to that.
Now, in addition to direct written contact with the European Commission, will the Federation be seeking support from CARICOM to take action from the regional level?
I think we will, yes. We're seeking support from CARICOM. Other CARICOM members also included. I see St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua and Barbuda. I believe the Bahamas are on the list. And also some overseas territories like Anguilla, Cayman, and the British Virgin Islands are also on the list. And again, it will be for each jurisdiction to make their own case. And I can only speak to my jurisdiction. But certainly I feel that this list is terribly unfortunate. the way it was done, the way it was published, and the disproportionate impact that it will have. If Bulgaria or Lithuania claim to have an issue with us in terms of how we handle taxes and taxation, then I think it would be incumbent on them to engage with us, not refuse to engage and then to somehow declare that we are the worst tax haven in the world. And if they're saying that of us, what of France? What of the United Kingdom? What of Germany and others with whom clearly we have a different sort of relationship? So I think that is the difficulty. But the EU is 28 countries, and it's always, I suppose, difficult when one is managing a large grouping such as that to get consistency in approach. But what we are saying very loudly is that we cannot have one international body, the OECD Global Forum, giving us a stellar grade in this area, and the EU, or an outshoot of the EU, being these 10 countries, saying something different. That type of inconsistency is terribly bad for our reputation and bad for business.
Now, since the release of the list, has there been any negative implications for St. Kitts and Nevis?
No, I don't think there have been. It is, however, still early days. But I think our response to this has been mature and reasonable. It has been immediate, and we are responding not in an emotive way, but rather by pointing out the facts. And I think that members of the EU that we engage in on a fairly regular basis are well aware of the missteps, so to speak, that might have been made here. And it is our hope that other Caribbean territories and CARICOM countries impacted, that they too would make the necessary representation.
Now, what is the potential plan of action if, when the European Commission releases its finalized list of the worst tax havens, St. Kitts and Nevis is again included?
Well, we are in a global environment where we can't tell them what to do. And so obviously all we can do is make representation. But if it is that they were to include us, notwithstanding the obvious progress that we've made and the very clear indications, I said less than a year ago, we were said to be fairly compliant or substantially compliant. I think that is the language. But the reality is that we have engaged in a very positive and forthright way with it. And I feel that if they insist on going down this particular road, what it has the potential to do is to derail that kind of engagement and cooperation. Because people are not going to say, well, I'm cooperating with you and you're still exercising punitive actions against me, so why bother? So I feel that it's in the interest of the European Union to really reconsider this particular approach. And the fact that just 10 out of 28 countries can put you on a blacklist, I think is unreasonable. So these are things that I suppose they'll have to look at in terms of their own internal mechanisms, and we will have to continue to make necessary representations. We are particularly aggrieved by this because we had the EU CELAC summit in Brussels just a matter of 2.5 or so weeks ago, and the whole of CARICOM and the Caribbean region were there, and there was no hint, no suggestion from the EU that something like this was coming down the pike. You know, so these are the types of things that we're saying. This is really unacceptable in an atmosphere of cooperation, an atmosphere of bilateral engagement on an ongoing basis between the Caribbean as a community and the EU, that we ought not to have these surprises sprung on us. And if there are issues, we ought to have had an opportunity, even on the margins of the EU CELAC summit, to discuss them. But this wasn't raised at all. So these are the types of concerns that we have and that we will certainly be looking at. But in terms of a plan of action, I think that our plan remains the same. Continue to engage constructively in a mature way and continue to present the facts that St. Kitts and Nevis is not some tax haven, rather we are a responsible financial center.
Okay. Now moving on to other issues, where is St. Kitts and Nevis at this time with regards to the recommended improvements to the Citizenship by Investment program?
Well, I think that we're making good progress. We have just last week convened the first ever conference of providers, countries that provide this program. We had Dominica, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Kitts and Nevis represented. It was convened by KITTS, which, as you know, is an international group, security group. And they are the ones who have done the top to bottom review for us. They've made recommendations. We are now in the process of implementing those. But that conference was important because it was not a sales conference, rather it was a conference, a working conference, where we also brought in the United States, Canada, the EU, and the UK. And we asked all the relevant stakeholders to sit around and come up with what we hope will become minimum standards to inform the industry. So yet again, CIGITS, which pioneered this particular industry, is taking the lead in a sense of saying now that we are at a stage where reforms are necessary, that we are asked in the region and the world as a global leader in this particular field to engage in best practices and to develop a code of minimum standards that we will all adhere to, lest there be some risk of a race to the bottom. So for us, we think it's a very positive step. We feel that the reform process is going well. I believe the expectation is that we'll be in Parliament next month with a package of regulations to implement most of those reforms that require implementation through Parliament. And so it is my hope that very shortly we will be coming out on the other end of this trying period, a much leaner, cleaner, and well-regulated, and most importantly, well-respected CBI program. We have also, of course, continued our bilateral engagement with major countries, major allies, the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, the EU. It's speaking to them and allaying concerns that they may have, looking at their concerns and seeing how best we could address them. And that dialogue now is open. Our government, the approach is one of transparency and openness, and we feel that that's an approach which will augur well for the industry and for the development of our country.
Thank you so much for joining us, Minister Brantley.
Thank you for the opportunity. Take good care.
You too.